Folks, welcome back. Joining me now, I sound stuffed up. You know why that is? Because I am stuffed up. I have a cold. I'm in Dallas, and okay, I'll be fine. I'm talking right now. Joining me now is Ryan Bangert with the Alliance Defending Freedom. Ryan, we last saw each other. It's kind of bizarre. People wonder why I'm confused. I travel all around and I bump into people in these different places. Last I saw you, we were in London together. So it's a little funny to be in Dallas suddenly a week later. And it's like, hey, here you are. Where do you live?
Well, I live down in Austin. It's great to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. Yeah, so you're in Austin. I live in New York, but we bumped into each other in London, and now here we are in Dallas. How long have you been with the Alliance Defending Freedom?
Since 2020, so right after the election in 2020.
Yeah.
I joined ADF.
Well, so you and I bumped into each other. I want to talk about this. We were in London at the ARC conference, and ARC stands for...
Alliance for Responsible Citizenship.
Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which just sounds like so hopelessly vague to me. But I guess Jordan Peterson is one of the folks behind it, and it was a real who's who of interesting conservative thought leaders. It was fascinating. There were so many friends. Oz Guinness was there. I didn't hear one of the talks. I didn't hear any of the talks, but a number of people, and you just mentioned it now, were taken with Oz Guinness's talk. I think he wrote a book called Our Civilizational Moment, and so it was a talk, I guess, about that.
It sure was. In fact, it's a great concept of a civilizational moment. I mean, here we are at a hinge point in history. And we've had this concept of the long 20th century. It just seemed like the 20th century and all of its pathologies and all of its politics just continued and continued up until 2024. And a lot of people think that the Trump election in 24 might be the real break with the past and a doorway to the future.
It's like, when did the 20th century officially end? I think it was in 2024 when President Biden coughed up a hairball right before one of his naps. I really, it's such a strange thing to think of these moments in history, and it does seem like the Biden administration was the horrible ending, like it almost grotesque kind of ending of all of these horrible trends finally converging in a way that it was like some kind of a nightmare, and that we are now at the beginning of a new era. I certainly hope that, because, well, I've talked enough about that kind of thing on this program over the years. But what did you get from why was he suggesting that we're at a civilizational moment? Because I do agree that this is a hinge. This is a moment that it's an astonishing moment. But what did Oz say? What did you pick up?
Well, Oz pointed out a couple of things, and one is that the West has to face a question, and that is, are we going to reclaim our historical identity as a civilization grounded on Judeo-Christian concepts and values? And I think you saw over the last 4 years in ADF, we certainly saw it. Under the Biden administration, we hit almost like peak woke. We were suing the Biden administration, it seemed like every other week, over rulemakings, over actions that were being taken by the Biden administration to redefine Title IX, the definition of sex in Title IX, to say it meant gender identity, to tell doctors they had to perform abortions, to tell doctors they had to perform quote-unquote gender transition surgeries. These are crazy ideas, and yet they were being embraced fully by what they called whole-of-government programs in the Biden administration.
Well, and again, most people listening, I think, are just aware of it was a level of pathology. We've never seen anything like it. I mean, it really was unhinged lunacy, and nobody knew where it was going to go. Do we just go into a permanent dark age? Is it over? And somehow, by God's grace, we seem to have pulled out of this impossible death spiral, and we seem to be at the beginning of what may well be a golden era. And it's beautiful. And I think we have to, remind ourselves. So what is Western civilization? What are these things that we took for granted and that we allowed, to decay and erode until, suddenly we got desperate and we said, hey, wait a minute, we got to do something. But when we're talking about, quote unquote Judeo-Christian values, I taped a number of Socrates in the City sessions while we were in London. And one of those, we asked this eternal question. Tertullian asked it, I think in the 4th century, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And so it's these values that we get from classical Greece and somewhat from Rome, combined with, the Hebrew ideas, that ultimately they come together and they create this beautiful thing called Western civilization, which of course is also called Christendom, over the centuries. But did Oz talk about that in his speech?
Oz hinted at a lot of that. And I think one of the things that was talked about very much at the ARC conference as we were there was J.D. Vance in Munich, delivering an incredible address and talking about the way that EU officials have systematically stripped their own citizens of civil rights, including the right to freedom of speech. And he mentioned our client, Adam Smith Connor, a veteran in the UK who was silently praying on a sidewalk outside an abortion clinic where years before he and his girlfriend had aborted their unborn son. Didn't say a word. He was just praying in his mind. And he was prosecuted for a thought crime under the UK's buffer zone law. And J.D. Vance called them out on that. But you talk about values of Western civilization, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, free exercise of religion. And why is that? Because man is called by God into a relationship with God. Man is obligated to speak truth in order to propagate the gospel. These are foundational values to Western civilization.
It's incomprehensible stuff. I think we have to, we have to allow ourselves to be taken aback by this and never think, well, that's just the way it is. No, we ought to be horrified at the prospect anywhere in the world of somebody being, arrested for praying silently, much less any place in the West. And so, yeah, J.D. Vance's speech was, I have to say, really startling in a way, because here he is going to European leaders and saying, hey, Europe, you're not behaving like the Europe that we made this deal with, following World War II. We made a deal that we had shared values, and so we would stand up for each other and so on and so forth. And you have drifted so dramatically far from those values that we kind of don't know who you are anymore. You're not... We didn't sign up to partner with people that don't believe in free speech, that don't believe in their own citizens having a say in how they're governed. We didn't sign up for that. And unless you're willing to be, have some fidelity to these shared values, we really don't owe you anything more than we owe Russia anything.
That's exactly. In fact, there was an attendee at the ARC conference, Matthias Desmet. He's a professor over in Belgium. Wrote a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And he traces back to the COVID pandemic, where you had it was incredible what was happening. And we had examples of this where ADF was litigating some of these cases, where the Biden administration, the White House, was leaning on social media companies to scrub from their pages any commentary that didn't toe the party line on what vaccines did and masking. And Matthias pointed out, he said, look, this is mass psychosis. This is mass formation. And what it takes people of principle and courage who are willing to speak out, even at risk to their own lives and fortune, to speak truth. And oftentimes what you'll have a large number of people who are just going along to get along. And when they see that beacon of truth, if someone exercises courage, it makes all the difference. And I think that's the distinction we're seeing now.
I met Matthias you and I were in this kind of VIP area, and somebody introduced him to me because I'd heard about the book. But it really is, we have to say this over and over. What we've lived through in the last 4+ years, it's unprecedented. It's certainly unprecedented in the United States of America. I mean, people talk about the Salem witch trials. This was exactly like that, on a much higher level, where you have an entire civilization absolutely buying lies, and not just buying lies, pushing lies, insisting that you agree with the lie, or we'll silence you, we'll cancel you. And, I was canceled and persecuted significantly. I don't really talk about it much. But of course, the reason I don't talk about it is because so many were canceled and persecuted far more than I was. And if you're not outraged by that, you are part of the problem. And there are many, many people who are part of the problem. And worse than that, many pastors and many Christian leaders that were perfectly willing to go along with this. In my book, Letter to the American Church, I reference we're now at the NRB. I was at NRB maybe 3 years ago in the middle of this stuff, and a respected pastor was in a little forum talking about, I don't mention his name, I saw him earlier today actually, talking about how he deliberately on his huge program never brought up this stuff that might get him canceled. And I thought, well, that's the problem right there, is that rather than bravely speaking about this kind of stuff and joining those who are bravely speaking, he thought, oh no, I don't want any trouble. I just want to get to do what I want to do or what I think is so important. And so we've never lived through anything like this. It's just amazing, and it's only by the grace of God that we're turning the bend here and arriving at a happy moment. We'll continue our conversation. I'm talking to Ryan Bangert. He's with ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom. Don't go away. Folks, welcome back. I continue my conversation here at NRB with Ryan Bangert of the ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, who are heroes. And we have talked with many folks from the Alliance Defending Freedom on this program over the years. So you wanted to respond to something that I just said, Ryan.
Yeah, you were talking about cancellation and censorship. And there's a great Substack run by N.S. Lyons where he put up a piece, long-form piece, very long piece, called The China Convergence. And he pointed out that in totalitarian countries like China, you have hard totalitarianism where they're just going to punish you through the force of law. But in Western countries, we're always at risk of soft totalitarianism where societal norms will militate against speaking truth. And we've seen that here in the U.S. I mean, you talked about your experiences with cancellation, but look at what happened in California just last year. Governor Newsom became enraged when he saw a parody tweet from a parodist named Mr. Reagan USA. Puts up this tweet sort of mocking Kamala Harris's campaign announcement, using AI to voice over some things that she didn't say.
Right.
And he said, this has got to stop. So he passes a law that effectively makes satire nearly illegal in California.
Yeah.
So we sued him on behalf of the Babylon Bee and on behalf of Rumble.
Now, I forgot this.
Yeah.
So you guys at the Alliance Defending Freedom sued Governor Newsom over this issue on behalf of the Babylon Bee and other satirists.
That's right. That's right. We sued him because the law that he passed said, hey, if you're going to put up satire that makes a political candidate look bad, which is sort of the definition of satire, well, then you got to put up a big disclaimer. And it has to be in the same font size as the largest font. So you can think of a really funny satire or parody you would see on the Babylon Bee's website, a video, with a giant disclaimer covering the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of ruins the point of satire.
I mean, what I'm always horrified at is when leaders like Governor Newsom show their staggering ignorance. I mean, it's a staggering thing that the governor of a large state could be so astonishingly ignorant of the basics of what it is to be an American, the basics of the idea of free speech. I mean, that's a scary thing that you think, this is not some dumb kid. You know, this is not AOC. This is somebody who has risen to be the governor of a large state who seems to be ignorant of this. The same thing happened, speaking of California, Dianne Feinstein, who of course passed away, but she was, when Amy Coney Barrett was, being questioned in the Senate about her beliefs, you have Senator Dianne Feinstein, who at this point is an octogenarian, clearly showing that she's hostile to the basics of religious liberty. I mean, she basically is excoriating Amy Coney Barrett for really believing in her Christian faith. And I thought, how do you get to a place where, senior figures in the American government do not get the basics? It really would be like a writing teacher who doesn't know how to spell the word cat. You'd say you can't. You really have to have people that understand this. And how is it possible that a senator or a governor could get to a point where they don't get these basics? That to me it's a scary moment.
But we're massively constitutionally illiterate here in the United States. I mean, take the example of what's happening in Oklahoma right now, where we represent the charter school board in Oklahoma. And they approved for members for entry into the charter school program, St. Isidore of Seville Virtual Catholic Charter School. No big deal, right? They could become a charter school, participate in the program, except they were sued. And they were sued because they're a religious school. And the plaintiffs said, well, you can't have a religious school in the charter school program. And the Oklahoma courts upheld that. So now we're going to be going to the U.S. Supreme Court at the end of April and arguing that case before the U.S. Supreme Court. It's Oklahoma Charter School Board versus Drummond. But that's just an example of how illiterate we can be in America as to core constitutional principles like freedom of speech and free exercise of religion.
I have to ask you, Ryan, because I'm always interested in people, how did you get to be doing what you're doing now? Where did you grow up, and how did you find yourself, wanting to work with ADF?
Well, I had the privilege back in 2002 of being a Blackstone Fellow. One of the earliest classes of our Blackstone Fellowship. It's a legal training program that we do for law students. We have over 3,000 fellows now around the globe. But I was always connected with them that way. I became a commercial litigator here in Dallas at a law firm, and then went to work for a senator. Actually, at the time, he was an attorney general, Josh Hawley, one of my heroes. And so, fantastic guy. Also worked for the Texas Attorney General's office for a while, and found my way to ADF. Really was invited to join by my friends there. It was such a privilege to have the chance to come home and do this work for an organization like Alliance Defending Freedom.
Well, I'm so glad you're working for the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's funny you mentioned Josh Hawley. He's one of the folks, clearly gets this stuff. Not all senators get this, which I just said, but when somebody really does get it, you think, well, this gives me hope for the nation. But this was as basic as it got. I mean, throughout our history, everyone had to get this kind of stuff, And we've had our moments where, you have to have correction, you have to have, but we've lived through a very strange season, and again, we mentioned it just a moment ago about the Biden administration. It was. I think for most Americans, we never thought we could go there. We could never get to a point where just unshirted lunacy is reigning and being pushed forward. And in large part, I would say, thanks to the Alliance Defending Freedom, we've been able to, pull that back and not have it, take over. I want to talk to you about some of the cases that you guys have handled at ADF. We're going to go to a break here. Folks, this is the Eric Metaxas Show. We're at the NRB. Don't go away. Welcome back. Talking to Ryan Bangert of the Alliance Defending Freedom. I wanted to touch on some of the cases that you guys at ADF are working on or have worked on.
Yeah, we've got a case coming up on April 2nd. We're arguing at the U.S. Supreme Court. The state of South Carolina excluded abortion providers from receiving Medicaid funding. In other words, the state didn't want to provide taxpayer dollars to abortion providers. Imagine that, right? And of course, Planned Parenthood sued and said, well, we can't have that. So we're going to be that case is going to be argued before the U.S. Supreme Court on April 2nd. ADF's own John Bursch will be arguing that case. But that's a really interesting question about whether or not a state has the ability to control how taxpayer dollars are being used and whether Planned Parenthood has some sort of right to access that funding. I mean, and we've been really gratified to see the Trump administration pull back in the first month of the administration from pushing federal funds to abortion providers. But we really need to focus, I think, over the next 4 years on institutionalizing these changes, on building up the institutions necessary, because there's been a great crumbling and tearing down of institutions, and we need to do some building over the next 4 years to institutionalize these good changes.
Well, it's so fascinating to me that so many people, including pro-life activists, thought, well, Donald Trump's not pro-life enough for me. I would agree with that, but you have to say, well, compared to what? Because if he hadn't been elected, you would have the most horrifyingly pro-abortion, administration in history, literally. And to think that he pardoned all of these pro-lifers who had been imprisoned. I mean, you can't even believe this, that imprisoned by the Biden administration for being, one of them is a friend of ours, been on the program, Bevelyn Beatty. And so on the one hand, you have the Biden administration, the Harris administration, imprisoning people for standing up for the unborn and going after them extremely aggressively. I mean, it's very clear, very partisan. And then Trump comes in and pardons these folks. He could just say, "Oh well, I don't want to get involved." So it's a sea change, frankly. It's just absolutely astonishing to me how dramatic. I mean, I don't think anybody in our lifetimes has ever seen anything like this. The change from what we had to what we're seeing now.
Usually presidents wait until the end of their term to pardon people. Came right out of the gate and pardoned these peaceful pro-life activists who were being prosecuted under the FACE Act. But this weaponization of government, and this is a real problem. We have a case that's pending at cert petition at the U.S. Supreme Court right now, First Choice versus Platkin. This is a pro-life pregnancy resource center that serves vulnerable women who are in these really difficult situations. And they have been relentlessly pursued by the Attorney General in the state of New Jersey, Platkin, who is an avowed radical pro-abortionist. And he has been targeting them with investigatory subpoenas, asking for the identity of their donors, asking for documents and records going back 10 years. ADF has been representing First Choice against this intrusive use, this lawfare, effectively.
Yeah.
And this case has now landed on the doorstep of the U.S. Supreme Court. We're still waiting to see whether the court will take it. But this is just an example of how, even though Trump has been fantastic about peeling back federal weaponization of government, you're still seeing it in blue states like New Jersey.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt about it. Well, we have a lot of fight to go. Like it's not over, and that's the whole thing. We have to just keep going and keep going. I was interested because I saw you at the ARC in London. I wanted to bring up that I was very encouraged when I was over there to think that Europeans want what we have here. Like they see what's going on and they think, I'd like a piece of that. We were in an Uber, and the Uber driver was like, yeah, we'd like to get some of that Doge over here, kind of cut some of that waste. And I thought most people would want that. But I think people in Europe have really been, it's as if they've had, 25 years of a Biden administration. They've really been suffering under this socialist, lunatic, anti-we the people thinking that it's these bureaucratic elites ruling over them. And I think, not only have they suffered under it and have come to the end of being willing to put up with it, but I think that seeing what is happening in the United States under this second Trump administration, there's a real hope and a desire to get that. I don't know to what extent that can happen or how that works, but I just sensed that when I was over there talking to different people.
I did too. In fact, there were several people who, after J.D. Vance spoke in Paris and then again in Munich, who said, I think J.D. Vance actually speaks for me, and I'm a European. And they were looking to the United States to lead on these issues relating to freedom, relating to civil rights, relating to government accountability. And we are so privileged here in the United States to live under one of the greatest charters of freedom ever conceived by human hands, the U.S. Constitution.
I think the greatest.
Yeah.
I don't think there is anything greater.
I'm trying to think what I can compare it to, and there's not much. Definitely not Hammurabi's Code or anything like that.
No.
So, but it's a tremendous document. And the First Amendment, I mean, what a blessing to have a document that enshrines its very first fundamental liberty, the right to freedom of speech, free exercise of religion. I mean, these are real blessings that we as Americans oftentimes take for granted.
Well, and again, to be reminded, J.D. Vance in his speech in Munich reminded us that Europe doesn't have this. It's kind of shocking because we think of Europe as being so much like us, but then you realize, no, they're not. They don't. They weren't really. I mean, because you could even have argued that. I mean, many of the patriots during our revolutionary era were arguing that, hey, these are English values. But King George III was like, well, no, I don't think so, because these are foundational ideas, and it is interesting unless you enshrine them in a constitution and in our amendments, and unless you have a population, a citizenry that understands these things and lives them out, they go away. And that's exactly what has happened in Western Europe. You have all these nations that we think, well, they're sort of like us. They're not. And you're now seeing the fruit as they have drifted in a certain direction. It's very, very dramatic. And because you think if they really were like us, then J.D. Vance's diplomatic speech in Munich would not have come across to them like a big slap in the face. But they were so stunned to hear him speak these basic things, to speak the truth, and I thought he did it very diplomatically. So I was just so proud that we have him as vice president, and God bless President Trump for picking him. We're out of time. Brian Bangert, just a joy to speak with you. God bless you, and God bless the Alliance Defending Freedom. You guys are heroes. Very grateful for you, so thank you.
Thank you, Eric.